government. What is it good for? We constantly complain that government lies to us or that it's corrupt. Still, we want more of it. We're discussing with Greg Salmieri from the Ayn Rand Institute from the perspective of objectivism, what is the proper role of government. Greg, thanks for being here and answering some questions. It seems to me that we're in an age where everything has evolved. If we looked at medicine, the way we produce food, art, technology, all the different aspects of human life have evolved, have become more efficient, and still we govern ourselves with systems that are quite obsolete. I mean, they come from the Greek times, and even democracy has been thought of as a system that has a lot of failures. But still, within the objectivist philosophy, there is an advocacy and a defense for government to exist. Why is that?
So I don't think it's true that the forms of government we use haven't improved, are the same since the Greek times. I think they got a lot worse after Greece, and then there was a period where they got a lot better. And in particular, I think the 18th century, 17th and 18th, but particularly the 18th century, and early 19th century, we saw a lot of improvements to government. I think the United States form of government is not something that you find in the ancient world. It's a new type of republicanism that was a result of a lot of innovations by Enlightenment philosophers and then by America's founding fathers. I think America's system of government then influenced the system of government in most of the European countries and most of the rest of the world. And I think both in America and in Europe, and really now all over the world, we've had further improvements from the American system to universal or near universal suffrage, recognizing women and people of different racial backgrounds and so forth as equally human, which I don't think any previous system of government did. So there are respects in which government has improved, but other respects in which it's gone backwards or stagnated. I think that's true.
Some people think that democracies are the tyranny of majorities and that always a minority will suffer. And sometimes majorities democratically elect dictators that then annihilate individual rights. So democracy seems to not be enough to defend individual rights. And people now in America talk about, oh, America as a democracy, when in fact, America is a republic. It was founded as a republic. And we talk about the differences in between an absolute democracy and a republic.
Yeah, I mean, always with the vocabulary, the words democracy and republic have each been used for different kinds of systems throughout time. And you can get yourself into paroxysms over it. But democracy understood, a lot of people think of America as a democracy. They think of democracy as what's good about America, and they think democracy is the highest political value, and they understand it to mean voting. So the more responsive the government is to what the majority of the people want, the better. And I think that is a really bad view. It's really wrong, and it is just the tyranny of the majority. It's that old Mencken quote about two wolves and a lamb voting about what to have for dinner. And democracy in that sense, I think, is a bad thing, has been understood as a bad thing for a long time, and was something that America's founders were opposed to. What is the right system of government? Well, I think it's much more like what America has and what the system behind America's ideas are. And the key principle of the American system of government isn't voting, it's individual rights. It's protection of individual rights. It doesn't mean voting is unimportant. I think a system of representative government where you vote for your leaders is a crucial means of protecting individual rights. And I don't think you could have long-term a rights-respecting system of government, an individualist system of government, without voting, without representative government. But it's not as though, it's not the be-all and end-all, and it's not sufficient. And if you have voting without respect for rights, you don't have, I think, anything like a proper government. It's just a tyranny. What the key principle of proper government is that we get in America's Declaration of Independence, that governments are instituted among men to secure individual rights. And then voting is crucial as the means to, well, how are we going to decide the details of personnel and so forth? How are we going to decide what particular measures will secure individual rights? But it's got to be that everything else is understood as a means to securing individual rights, and the people who are voting take it as their responsibility to cast their votes for what they, in their best judgment, think will preserve and protect rights. And I have actually an essay on this in another one of the books, not the two we've been going on about, a book edited by Jonathan Hoenig called A New Textbook of Americanism. I have an essay on the role of voting in the American system that talks a lot about this. Maybe we can link to it because it's on the Ayn Rand Institute homepage, that essay.
Cool. And one of the things that I've noticed in this book, in Foundations of a Free Society, is that Harry Binswanger, he makes a point that actually resonates with why anarcho-capitalism is so popular within some of the libertarians. And he says, one of the arguments is that governments have always grown beyond their proper limits. So we must assume they will inevitably always grow. But he says this argument ignores why government grows. And the cause is bad philosophy, particularly altruism. The history of the United States shows exactly this. Our government has grown beyond its proper limits because Americans have thought that it ought to. So what would be the proper philosophy in order to keep the government limited to the functions that it should, and what are those functions?
So let me say first, this libertarian idea that governments keep growing and they grow beyond their scope, I think is totally ahistorical. It has nothing to do with actual history. Okay. There's one or two governments ever that started out pretty good, and those two have grown in ways that made them bad. They grew into things they shouldn't do. But if you look at the grand scale of human history, it hasn't been every generation the government's doing more and more things, they've grown. Government has, over the course of the millennia, 19th century governments were better than 16th century governments. Okay. They were more limited, closer to their proper functions. 18th century governments, 19th century governments, better still. It's in lots of ways governments have gotten better just over the grand scope of history. And even within American history, in the 1970s, there was not enough, but there had been a real race towards growing government intrusions in the economy over the 40s through the 60s. Mm-hmm. In the 70s, parts of the economy started getting deregulated. So even America's government hasn't just kept growing at random. When it does grow, it grows because people think it's right for it to. Yeah. When it grows into things it shouldn't do. And so the question, as you asked, is well, what should it do and why? And government, I think, has a single function. Its function is to protect rights. Mm-hmm. And it should grow when there are more things it needs to do to protect rights that it's not doing. And there are situations where that is the case, where it's not doing it. There aren't enough police, or there aren't laws that govern a certain domain, so that you've got like a Wild West and anarchy in that domain. And you need to have more laws about that domain so that government can protect rights in that domain. It's about figuring out the right. What it should not be doing is providing services to people. Mm-hmm. And what it's grown into doing is providing services to people and into other ways impinging on people's rights.
Do you think this is because of what Yaron Brook explains, that unfortunately the founding fathers didn't separate constitutionally the government from the economy, that it should be an article that says that there's an absolute separation, like from church and state, from economy and state, and that's what gave room to economic regulations, protectionism, lobbies?
I wish they had done that, and I think had they written an amendment like that, that would have been a big help in retarding this, but I don't think it's the primary cause. I think the primary cause of the growth is that people think that they don't understand what the function of government is, and they don't value their own liberty, and they don't value their own liberty, and they believe in altruism. And because they believe in altruism, they believe individuals owe it to the needy in any respect. People with values owe it to people without them to help them, and that if they're not giving them these things voluntarily, they're wronging them. And therefore, it's the job of the government to come in and, make you help the poor person that you're not helping, and to provide for people and to protect them against all the natural things that can go wrong, rather than what I think is its proper function, which is to preserve the liberty that we need to individually protect ourselves and to make the kind of arrangements among ourselves that are needed to protect for protection.
It seems to me that people start growing a preoccupation about the poor once they are rich, because when everyone is poor, no one cares about the poor. Everyone is like struggling to get out of poverty, and that's what happened in this country. No one was talking about welfare state or giving to the poor during the first centuries that this nation was established. It was only until there was a breaking point in between rich people and poor people that some would say, well, wait a minute. Why don't we have a New Deal? Why don't we have a social security system that then was replicated in the rest of the world, right? And also because of the influence of Bismarck in Europe and all of that. But it seems to me that in order for this preoccupation to show up, you first have to have a wealthy population. And it reminds me of what Marx said, that capitalism has within its own destruction, because once you have really wealthy people, then you start with this egalitarian arguments. Do you think that maybe it's because America got so successful that now socialism is such a buzzword, for example?
That's not my understanding of this. I mean, first I agree that it really started with Bismarck in Germany in terms of a social welfare state and spread to America, and from both Germany and America spread across the world. I think that if the ideas that liberty is based on are really revolutionary, were never fully understood, and were really fragile, and because they are in conflict with a lot of Judeo-Christian moral teaching, or Christian moral teaching anyway, but I think moral teaching of every religious tradition, and a lot of what people take for common sense. And because of that, because of the radicalness of it, it was inherently fragile. And I think as that period of people becoming very rich happened, as the standard of living was rising as a result of freedom across the 19th century, I think the real problem was that it was misunderstood. What was happening, what the causes of it are, were, I think, misconceptualized by the intellectuals of that time. And I see that, rather than there suddenly being people who are wealthier, as the cause of a move towards socialism. But I think I agree with you that the advent of some people who are comfortable, who could then look down at the poor people and feel sorry for them, is probably relevant to the particular form that the rhetoric took, and the particular form of socialism that became popular. But I think the fundamental is just not understanding what's happening, and not understanding why this wealth is accruing, why it's accruing to some people and in some places and not in others. What's making that possible? I think that's the fundamental.
So there are two views of what government should do. One is that government should protect rights, understanding rights as life, liberty, private property, the pursuit of happiness. So that basically gives the government two functions: security and justice. The rule of law, the equality under the law. And there is another vision that says, no, there's not only equality under the law, there should also be some kind of economic equality, equality of opportunities, and that gives the chance for the welfare state to exist. The government providing services like health or education or housing or even food. What is the take on objectivism towards the welfare state? Because during OCON, I heard some people talking about taxation, and they were like, yeah, I don't mind, paying taxes for some kind of welfare. So I'm not quite sure of what's the objectivist stand on welfare state.
So I don't know who is saying what around OCON. It's a big conference. There are hundreds of people there, so I can't speak for everyone there.
Yeah.
But I know what Rand's view is, and I know what my view is on it. So I think, and Rand thought, that the welfare state was illegitimate. The government should provide no social services, no social security, no money for poverty relief, Nothing like that.
Yeah.
And moreover, that there shouldn't be any taxes of any kind.
Of any kind.
Right, that government financing should be voluntary. And she had some views about different ways in which voluntary financing for the government might work.
But doesn't that make free riders? Like if voluntarily I pay for a government because I'm interested in, rule of law, I'm legitimately interested in that, but someone might not. But doesn't that create free riders that benefit from the ones who pay tax?
So I don't think free riding is much of a problem. Okay. I mean, I don't think it'll happen as much as people think. Okay. And Rand has some views about, in particular, what schemes one could use to finance a government. There's an essay, Government Financing in a Free Society, in the collection Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, about this. I think if those kind of suggestions were followed, there wouldn't be a ton of free riding. There were services of the government people would need to pay for, and I think they would, as they went about their business in order to go about their business well. And two, I don't think free riding is a problem, not just because it won't happen that much, but I don't think it's that bad when it does happen. If you're willing to do or pay or finance something because it's good for you and because you benefit from it, it's not a problem if some other people benefit from it too.
But what would you say to people that say, oh, that sounds like the anarcho-capitalist argument that once there's free market, there won't be like an incentive for anyone to monopolize force in an unfair way. Like what would you say to people that says that sounds like similar to that, like this hopeful thought that no one will become a free rider?
Well, it's not that no one will. I think some people will. Mm-hmm. But I don't think free riders are such a bane to the world. That is, if you need there to be police, you're a business owner, you're a productive member of society, you have a house, and it's important to you that there be police, and you recognize that if there were no police, things would go really badly. Mm-hmm. And you recognize that it needs to be police from the government with monopoly use of force, not your private security guards. And you're willing to pay your share to have them because you recognize how important they are to your life. If I'm someone who doesn't recognize that and doesn't pay it, and I happen to get protected by the fact that there are police too, that's sort of no skin off your back. You need these things, you recognize their value, you're willing to pay for them, and I happen to benefit. And if we think about, people build libraries, they build all kinds of things for their own sake in the world, because they recognize that they want them and they're better off with them. And then other people benefit from them incidentally. But again, I think the kind of taxation scheme or voluntary taxation scheme Rand talks about in voluntary government financing in a free society, where she talks about basically in order to make a contract such that it could be enforced in civil court, you'd pay a small amount on the sums involved in the contract, and you wouldn't have to pay that. But if you didn't pay it, there'd be no way to enforce the contract. So to make the contract legally enforceable, you pay a small amount, and enforceable in civil court. Basically, that would mean any credit transaction, any business transaction, you would have to pay on or be satisfied with a handshake deal that was unenforceable. Right. And I think in that situation, I don't think there'd be much free riding. It would be kind of minimal, and I don't think it would matter.
So what about like punctual public policy solutions that sometimes are proposed by the libertarian movement? For example, flat tax. Flat for everyone, like, I don't know, like the tax on sales tax, but everyone pays the same percent.
Oh, so I think those are tremendous improvements over what we have now. And one of the things that, I think a flat tax would be, and I think a sales tax, a consumption rather than a production tax, would be an improvement. And in general, the idea of moving to voluntary financing is something to be done late in a process of reform towards a freer society. We certainly couldn't afford it now. Once we're in a relatively free society, one of the last things to do is to go to that, to eliminate the last vestiges of taxation. In the meantime, I think one wants to make the taxation flatter. One wants to make the tax code as simple as possible so that you're not using it to manipulate the economy. And in this one respect, I might agree with the people at Ocon, who were saying, I don't mind paying taxes. I don't think taxes are the big problem with government. They're bad. We shouldn't have them. A fully free government wouldn't. But of all the things the government does that's bad, that harm people's abilities to pursue their lives, taxes are, lower on the list. The regulation of the economy, the regulation of people's personal lives, and the failure to protect people, protect their rights in realms when they need protection. For example, the failure to go after people who are attacking and shutting down people's free speech violently.
Right.
Those kind of things are, I think, one case where government's doing something it shouldn't, regulating in a way that it shouldn't, and one case where it's doing something, failing to do something it should, namely protect people against, jihadis who want to kill them for blaspheming. Yeah. Those things are, I think, bigger problems than how much money it seizes. It shouldn't be seizing the money, and it's bad, but that's, again, not the worst thing.
So what about, like, for example, temporary solutions? I see Latin America, a lot of generations where there has been exclusion, legislative exclusion of certain parts of the population. So you cannot like cut education and health from one day to the next, but you can implement some, more free market solutions, like for example, Milton Friedman's voucher system for education, where you incentivize the parents instead of like the teacher unions, or like individual health pension system, where each worker owns whatever they save instead of everything going to like a common pot that always gets exfoliated by the current government.
It's a difficult policy question, which transitional measures really are transitional measures towards freedom. And one has to think about it in the details of the cases. I don't know for all of them. In the case of education, I think the best measure I know of anyway, would be a tax credit for education measure. And this is something also Rand spoke about, which is different from Friedman's voucher system. Mm-hmm. So in a tax credit system, for each student, you pay for their education. Mm-hmm. You can get a credit from your taxes to a certain amount, which means like this much gets taken off your taxes. Not taken off your taxable income, but if you spend $200 educating somebody, your tax bill goes down by $200. Okay. Until you get to zero, you can't get extra money, right? So if you owe $30,000 in taxes and you're going to spend $30,000 on education, then you spend zero in taxes. And so we just take the money out of the government's budget for education, but we don't give somebody who only makes owes 15 grand in taxes. We don't give him 15,000. So in that situation, and there's a cap as to how much you could do this per student.
Yeah.
And the cap is however much the government would spend educating the student, basically. Mm-hmm. So if we had that, then parents who are spending more on taxes than they would on educating their own kids would divert that money to educating their own kids, right? And they would have school choice. Parents who aren't spending as much paying as much in taxes as it costs to educate their kids wouldn't be able to do that. But people who are paying way more in taxes than it costs to educate their own kids or who don't have kids could offer them scholarships and get the tax credit that way. And I think if you had that, you would create a situation where education became basically private. Mm-hmm. All of this money would go into the private market, controlled by the individuals who are spending the money, the parents or the people who are giving the scholarships. And there would be competition for schools, and this would be a way to get a market in schools. But importantly, it's not giving money to people. The government isn't redistributing money to people who don't pay enough in taxes to pay for their education costs. And the Friedman voucher program, I think, is less free market than this program, although it's probably an improvement over the current system. Yeah. So that's...
Why do you think it's so hard to convince people to take away education and health from the hands of government when they have no problem in getting least important things in the market, like for example, cell phone service or internet? No one depends on a cell phone to live. Like everyone lived okay in the 70s and 80s without it or without internet, but still people trust the market into giving, not the market, like private individuals into providing a good service in something that is not a matter of life or death, like, Wi-Fi or cell phones. But when it comes to something that is like crucial, like health and education, it doesn't matter how many times they hear that the government is robbing them, that the government is corrupt, that is inefficient to, manage these resources. They still have a hard time thinking that the government shouldn't provide these things.
I think they think it's wrong for the government not to, right? So they in effect think you're owed those things. Mm-hmm. The world owes you the things you need for living. Yeah. And because they think that, luxury items, they're fine with people being free to pursue. And then maybe some people don't have them, but they're not fine with what they regard as things that are necessary for life, right, being that way, because they think of the things that are necessary for life as things that we're owed, rather than thinking of them as things that it's necessary for us to provide for ourselves and to provide for our children if we have children, and then thinking about how we can free people to do that, including free them to charitably provide for other people if it turns out that some people are unable to provide for themselves. The thing that I find puzzling here, though, is what about food? I mean, food is the thing that's the most obviously necessary. And most people recognize that attempts to collectivized farming is widely recognized as a failure. And you don't see Ocasio-Cortez or the other modern day collectivists who think of themselves as socialists, Bernie Sanders, or the collectivists who want government to provide jobs to people like Trump, right? We don't think of Sanders too, or Cortez too. We don't think of them, they don't think we should collectivize food and farming. They recognize that that's a failure, even though it's a necessity. So it's interesting that it stuck, I guess, just because of the horrors of collectivized farming in the communist country and how many people died of famine, that it doesn't work there. But the more necessary something is, I think the more they think it's wrong for someone not to have it if someone else does. And therefore, it's the job of the government to make sure that that wrong is righted.
And this also brings me to the point of, okay, if these services are not provided by the government, but simultaneously are also privately provided. I mean, there are private schools, there is private hospitals. Even in Latin America, poor people rather go to private charities that take care of HIV patients or cancer patients or diabetes, because if they go to the public hospital, certainly they will die or they won't be, properly taken care of. So privately, the society has organized to have this private hospitals for charity. But still, it's hard for people to look at this as a more efficient solution than the government providing it.
I mean, I don't know the details of the situations in Latin America, and it differs from country to country, of course. Mm-hmm. But I think the way to be thinking about this is not efficiency. It's true that these governmental systems aren't efficient, but the bigger issue is they're not right. It's the moral framing, I think, is the essential here, and it's not just essential from the perspective of convincing people, but from really understanding it. So healthcare is a product. It's something that needs to be produced and created by somebody. And and that everybody needs to, in effect, create his own healthcare by producing values to trade with the people who produce the healthcare. And we need to be free to do all of that. And that is what it is to have a right to healthcare. What it is to have a right to healthcare is to have the right to create your healthcare. Yeah. And to have the right to trade in healthcare. Just like a right to property is not for people to give you property. It's the right for you to make it and earn it and own it. And likewise for healthcare. And once you recognize that that's the right way for things to be, again, if we're right, then that's the right way. But I think we are. If you think that's the right way, then you see all of these attempts to nationalize them, right? These attempts to control and interfere in the process by which people save their own lives and contract with one another to save one another's lives. You see that as wrong and evil. And it is true that evil is inefficient. Evil doesn't work well. And that's why people don't do well in these systems. But the essential is that it's wrong. It's wrong because it's interfering in the process by which people support their lives.
Now, it's also easier to control a government that does few things than to control a government that does everything. A government that does everything can rob you in everything and therefore has more chances of being corrupt. And it seems to me that some people have like Stockholm Syndrome. They are in love with their captor because they complain about the corruption of the government, but at the same time, they're not willing to take away the hundreds or dozens of tasks that they have deposited in the government to give to them. So there's like this permanent contradiction in which the population lives, and it's hard to get out of that contradiction. But one of the things that also people say is, well, why did Ayn Rand use the healthcare system in her latter years? Isn't that a contradiction when she was against healthcare?
She used it for the same reason that when she was in communist Russia, she took the pittance in the food she was given.
Yeah.
When you're in a system where you're living under force, where you're not free to provide for these goods on your own, and you're not free to keep your earnings and use them to provide for yourself in these situations, and you know that that's wrong, that system is wrong, and you're spending your life rebelling and fighting against it, it would be wrong to refuse the little bit of recompense you're given, and be a martyr. Just like it would be wrong to, let yourself die because you're not getting the food that you're being given as your one little allotment when you're in the USSR. Now, it's not the case that she would have died in her older years if she didn't go on take Medicaid or Medicare, whatever it was. She was actually fairly wealthy, and I'm sure she could have afforded it. She died with a considerable estate, but it would have been wrong of her to let herself be victimized by it. I mean, I plan to, when I retire, take whatever I can get back from the government and take whatever tax. It would be wrong to martyr yourself.
And also, you've been paying taxes for it.
Yes, exactly.
So what I say when I give conferences is, look, if you don't like libertarians or objectivists or even gays or atheists to profit from the things that are given in a welfare system, then let's make a list. And don't force us to pay taxes, because this also happens in Latin America, not only with people who are against the welfare system, but people who oppose for the LGBT community to have rights. And like some of my friends from the LGBT community say, okay, they don't want us to have rights, but then they should also don't want our money when it comes in the form of taxes, It's like this eternal contradiction. And I think that if you're forced to pay taxes, then why shouldn't you use the things that those taxes provide? And if not, well, then don't force me to pay taxes.
I mean, it's not that the government has goodies to give out and you take them or you don't.
Yeah.
What the government does is controls portions of your life when it does things it shouldn't. So the way your life should work is you make your money and you decide how to allot it among the various needs that you have in life. And you decide what job to take and how much money you're going to make in the job is part of it. And one of the things that you're factoring in as you do this is like, well, how am I going to retire? Do I want to retire at all? At what age? How am I going to save for it? Yeah. And another of the things that you're factoring into it is, well, what am I going to do about my healthcare needs? How risk averse am I? What kinds of healthcare needs am I likely to have? And how am I going to provide for that? And all of that thinking goes into your decisions about what jobs to take, your decisions about how to save, how to do other things. And what the government then does is it interferes in that process. It says, we don't care what your plans about retirement are. We don't care what your plans about health are. We're going to take this money away from you.
Yeah.
And then we're going to use it to dole out some health care for you when we think you need it. And we're going to use this to dole out retirement payments for you when you think you need it. We're taking money that's been yours all along, and we are going to, instead of giving you the freedom to choose which of your needs you're going to satisfy with it at which times, in which ways, we're going to use it to give it back to you if you need it to satisfy these needs at these times in these ways. So now once they've taken from you about what your healthcare budget might be, and they've taken from you about what your retirement savings budget might be, and now they're willing to dole back some little bit of it to you, well, it would be wrong of you not to take that.
No, and that's in the best case, because in Europe, the system is collapsing. Like people who are paying taxes now won't be able to benefit from that social security in the future if the current events continue as they are. But so wouldn't you agree, Greg, that if we take away all these services from the government, we separate it from the economics, what we have is a very limited government. And then the word minarchism could be in place because you are advocating for a minimal government.
Yeah, I don't like that word for it. I think your and my view of what the government shouldn't do are probably pretty similar. Mm-hmm. We can, see if there are any cases where we disagree, but it's pretty close. I mean, certainly in the grand scheme of people. But I don't like minarchism for it. One, it's a kind of made up word that you coined by putting together two other words. Not that you coined it, but but second, it makes it seem like what's important about it is that it's small. But what's important about it isn't that it's small, and it shouldn't be as small as possible. What's important about it is that it do all and only the right things. And the doing all the right things is as important as the doing only the right things. So that minarchism stresses that don't do more than it should.
Yeah.
But it also shouldn't do less than it should, and that's equally important. And there are lots of cases, some of them we talked about earlier, where governments are doing less than they should. So if you think about when there was lynchings in the South, the southern states of America, the government was not protecting the African American citizens from the racist whites. It was failing to do what it should, and these people were in danger. And you won't say, well, I want the government to be as small as possible. We want it to be bigger, more. There should have been more judges, more police, more things coming in to stop these lynchings, right? And likewise, there should be more resources devoted to protecting free speech. If Ben Shapiro is going to go speak at Berkeley, and there are going to be mobs that are going to beat people up and set things on fire to stop them from speaking, where the hell's the government? There's not enough government. There's not enough police, or not enough whatever there needs to be in Berkeley to catch and arrest these people and stop them from doing that, and to protect the speakers. So it should be doing all and only the things it needs to be doing. And I think what we want is a proper government, a delimited government. But
so limited is a concept that you like more, like limited government. Yeah.
And the other thing about min that I don't like in the minarchism is you imagine this scale. Like they have these charts that libertarians often put out where like, are you left and right, and there's this other axis. And at the one end of this other axis, you're a libertarian, you're an anarchist really. And at the other end, you're a totalitarian. And then there's minarchism, you're just a little bit away from anarchism. You're as close as though the consistent ideal would be anarchism. But anarchism is total force. Anarchism is living under brute force. And we're not, the whole way of thinking of a properly delimited government as minimal, as, as a quick shorthand, like the government does way too much, or I'm against big government, I'm okay with it. But for like precise thinking, I think the term is, we want a rights protecting government. A government that does all the things it needs to do to protect rights and none of the things that infringe on it. And that takes real work. What the government needs to do, what the government is there for, is to keep force out of human life. And the government should be separated from religion. But really what the government's position in the separation of church and state is the government's job is to keep force out of ideological matters, to keep force out of religious matters. So it shouldn't use its governmental force to support one religion or hurt another, but it should use its governmental force if someone else is privately trying to use force to impose religion. Like that's what jihadists are doing. They're blowing you up if you draw a picture of Muhammad, and the government should use its force to stop them from doing that, right? So in the area of religion, government should use force in retaliation, and it needs to use force to keep force out of human interactions in religion. And likewise in the economy. If someone's stealing and if someone's committing fraud, government needs to come in and use force to stop that. What it's doing is extracting force. It's using force in retaliation and using it objectively to keep people from forcing one another in that segment of life. And it needs to do that in every segment of life. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to figure it out. A new mineral is discovered, and if someone digs for it, it might disrupt the soil next to them. And we have to figure out, like, well, what does it mean to implement property rights here? New inventions are made, and they create new ways in which I might interfere with you that weren't possible before. And we have to, the new laws have to figure out, like, well, how do rights apply in this domain? And if government fails to do that, then people are left unprotected. Now people can be hacked, and like we have to think about like, well, what should the laws be against hacking? Hacking is a way of initiating force. And what laws should there be about hacking? What laws should there be about intellectual property in domain names or something? These kinds of things, you need a government to be vigorous and robust and to do the things that are needed to protect rights, to protect individuals in these domains, but not to do the things that are needed to control them.
Right, because there are a lot of governments that do a lot of what they shouldn't be doing, like in Latin America, controlling the economy, giving privileges, and little of what they should be doing, that is protecting rights. So what should be the proper bureaucracy of a proper government? Like, what does that system look like? Is there like an executive, legislative, and judicial branch? Which one of the three? For me, is like the judicial, because if you don't have like an independent, strong judicial branch, you don't have rule of law, which is like for me the basic of the government. But it seems to me that now we focus a lot on the executive, like who the president is going to be, and this lack of focus on the judicial has also made population ask the government to do a lot of what it shouldn't do instead of focusing on what it should do.
Yes. I agree in general we need a legislative, a judicial, and a executive power in government. Mm-hmm. They need to be separated from one another. Mm-hmm. I think the government needs to be, I think one of the real geniuses of the US system, which I think has worked reasonably well despite its failings, is that there have been checks on power, so that there are things the legislative can do, but things the executive can do. They're sometimes pitted against one another. And I think good government design involves building a lot of that into it. I think there are different ways to do it that are probably good. Like, so whether you have a prime minister or a president, and whether you have a bicameral or a unicameral legislature, and how powers are distributed between state level governments and federal level governments, or the equivalents in other parts of the world. I think there's a lot of options, that there are multiple ways to go that are good, and maybe different ones are better tailored to different populations. That I think is not a matter for philosophy, but a kind of more detailed political science. But I do think in most societies today, we have a kind of real worship of the executive that I think is a problem. And we have, at least in America, which I know best, the judicial, I think, has ceded too much deference to the legislature. So it's not taken seriously enough the role of knocking down laws when they violate fundamental constitutional law. And I think the legislature has ceded too much to the executive. It's passed vague laws that then have to get filled in by executive regulatory agencies. And more and more we have the concentration of the power in the executive branch, which I think is really bad because it makes for a lot of unpredictability. It makes for when, after the next election, things change all of a sudden. Trump staffed all these executive agencies with totally different people than Obama did, with very different policies, some of them better. But a big change, and then the next president will staff them with someone else. And too much swings on individual elections of presidents because they have so many personnel who are in charge of so many regulations to change with them. If all the president did was enforce the laws, see that the military was working properly, send people out, but the actual laws were made by the legislature, and the legislature had to have a vote, and it took time and so forth, I think each individual presidential election and legislative election would be less important. There'd be less at stake in the moment. And I think that would lead to more predictability in people's lives and a healthier political process. And I wish we could get back to something like that.
What about currency? Because Rand was very fond of the dollar. Actually, the sign of the dollar is quite important in Atlas Shrugged. And to have a proper separation between economics and the state, do you think that currency should be a monopoly of the government, that only the government should issue it? How does objectivism look at now cryptocurrencies that are trying to compete with, like formal currencies that are issued by government?
So Rand favored a gold standard, and she favored, I think, free market money, which she thought would be on a gold standard. She didn't write much about this, but there's an article on the gold standard by Alan Greenspan before he became a statist in her book Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And I think on her way of thinking, the role of the government with the dollar was just defining it as a standard way to measure it. It's this much gold.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if we even need the government to do that. I might need to set standard terms so that contracts are interpreted unambiguously. But I don't know, I could just say I'm going to pay you in this many ounces of gold. So I'm not sure it even needs to do that. I'm not an economist, and I don't really have developed views on if we had a free market in money now, would it be a gold standard? Would it be a basket of commodities?
Yeah.
Would it be silver? What about cryptocurrencies? Could they work? I'm skeptical that a cryptocurrency could be an independent currency, but I'm not, that is independent of having some other backing, but I'm not, certain of or confident in that. And I think it's an issue that's really for economists. It requires specialized knowledge that's not part of philosophy.
Well, Greg, if there's anything else that you want to add, I just want to thank you, not only for this interview, but for all the ones that we've done, exploring why anarchism doesn't work, the proper role of government, what are rights. I think these are super important issues. And I want to thank you because you encouraged me to read this book. And thanks to this, we have, been sitting down and having these discussions that I think are very important. I do believe that there are valuable things that both objectivism and libertarianism, especially the ones that are not anarchists, can keep on working on. And I think that these discussions are really valuable. And I hope that after this, more libertarians and objectivists get to sit down and discuss other issues. I
mean, my main issue with when we talk about libertarians is I think it's a word that doesn't have all that much meaning. And that if I learn that someone's a libertarian, I really don't know that much about them by knowing just that. I mean, I really don't even know that much about their political views.
Right.
So among the people who call themselves or get called libertarians, at least in the English-speaking world, there are a lot of them that I think have a lot of good ideas, and I think a lot of good inclinations, and I think that I'm really on the same side with and want to be talking with. But there are a lot of others who aren't, and I think the label libertarian for all of them is something I think that does more harm than good, except if we think of it as just like a historical, these are people who are outside of the mainstream because the mainstream won't have them for the same reason. Right. But what I would encourage, and one theme I've been making in some of my pushback occasionally on questions with you, and what I'd encourage all readers to think about is worry less about am I a libertarian or should libertarians unite and what about libertarians and objectivists, and more about like what's actually right here and how can I tell. And the fact that we do or don't share a label is less important than thinking, all right, I say I'm for liberty, she says she's for liberty, he says he's for liberty, but Che Guevara said he was for liberty too, and so did Ayn Rand, and so did Frederick Douglass, and so did Henry Hazlitt, and so did Murray Rothbard, and so did Karl Marx, and Vladimir Lenin, and Adolf Hitler, and everyone, good, bad, in between, and some people I can't tell whether they are, says they're for liberty. So that's not enough. We got to think about what we mean by it. Okay. And which of us mean the same things and which of us don't, and which of us have some overlap but not complete overlap. And then in light of that, what specific things can we work together on to advance each of us our conception of what we think is a better world. And one thing I think a lot of us can work together on, even where we have pretty significant disagreements, much more significant than any you and I might have, is the goal of trying to get to the bottom of these questions. So I'm happy to talk to an anarcho-capitalist, for example, and we have some in this book, if what we're trying to do is to get clear on like, well, what do we each think about these issues, and how are we alike and different, and what's the truth here so that each of us can go away and think about it more clearly. What I'm not happy to do is try to work together with him to create the kind of world we both want when it turns out we don't really want the same kind of world.
Right.
And so I'm very happy to work together with people to kind of try to get clearer on what the different options are. And then of the ones where we find that we want the same thing, how can we work together to achieve it?
Yeah, and I think that these exercises are precisely that, especially for our audience, that they can listen to you and to other scholars that we've been talking about here in the Ayn Rand Institute, so they can figure out if we're in the same page of what you're thinking that a society should look like and should work like.
Let me say one other thought, and something I sort of wish I'd said a little bit earlier when we talked about why did things go bad and why did capitalism not get appreciated in the way it did. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I said people weren't understanding what was happening with the great standard of living increase in the 19th century, but also they weren't, as part of the not understanding it, they weren't morally evaluating it properly. All of these people who created this great wealth, that wasn't seen as something that was morally good about them.
Yeah.
And when people themselves in their own life ran a business and helped themselves and made their lives better, they didn't appreciate it about themselves. Is that something that's morally good?
Yeah.
There was a lack of moral seriousness in thinking about politics. And I think a lot of lack of moral seriousness in people thinking about their own lives. And one thing that I really appreciate when I see in people is that kind of moral seriousness. And I like that I see that in you, and we talked about some conversations at Ocon where that really came out for all of us, and to encourage everyone else to take a moral perspective on your own life. If you want to be free and you want other people to be free, it's because you want to make something of your life and do something with it. And that's good. And you should acknowledge that as good.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Greg. It has been amazing picking your brain and clarifying a lot of things that I encounter in this amazing book, Foundations of a Free Society, that you can find in the Ayn Rand Institute. Download the app and stay tuned because we have more in this series.